In December of 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen published an article in a German physics magazine called On a New Type of Ray. Less than a month after his discovery, the fields of X-ray, fluoroscopy, nuclear medicine, and radiation therapy were formed, setting the basis of what we currently practice today. In the same year, multiple books, films, and novelty items featuring the new X-ray science became widely available. But in an age before information was traded as quickly as it is today, how did this happen? The answer begins with Crookes tubes. Around 1869, a new type of highly pressurized vacuum tube was perfected and put onto the market by a chemist named Sir William Crookes, who intended to use it to study the behaviors of gases. Every scientist and experimenter from Thomas Edison to Nikola Tesla had one in their workshops to experiment with. The other reason X-rays became as popular as they did was because Röntgen's article was written plainly in a language that the majority of the educated world could understand. It contained no math and was relatively easy to read. Since the Crookes tubes were widely available, the results were easily reproduced. Once Röntgen and the magazines realized the weight and significance of the discovery, the article was rerun with what is considered to be the first X-ray, this picture of his wife's hand. Within months, Röntgen's rays had seized the attention of everyone across the world. Doctors and surgeons immediately recognized the beneficial uses, and within months of the article's publishing had used X-ray images to remove a bullet from a soldier's head, and had used the degenerative properties of X-rays to treat the breast cancer of a young woman. A short, humorous film depicting X-rays was produced by Edison's own fledgling movie studio. Traveling fairs set up their own X-ray photo booths, where one could see their own insides, or take an X-ray of their hands or feet home. A French writer named Charles Requelin wrote a science fiction story called Les Rayons X, a story in which a surgeon injects his eyes with a substance that gives him the astonishing power of making the eyes accessible to Röntgen rays, the famous ray then impassioning all of Europe. Famous sci-fi author H.G. Wells made mention of them in his 1897 book The Invisible Man. In 1904, one novelty company patented X-ray specs, a product that would later be sold as two pieces of cardboard with a feather between them. To draw in customers, shoe stores started offering X-rays of their patrons' feet to show the proper fit of the shoe. With all publicity came negatives. Advertisers, eager to prey on the fear of the novel and unknown, began selling lead-lined underwear to protect those from unwanted eyes. One congressman even went so far as to propose a bill banning the use of X-ray in opera glasses, just to cash in on a little bit of publicity for himself. At the same time Röntgen was reprinting his articles, two French scientists and wife and husband science team were making headway on furthering the research of radiation: Henri Becquerel, Paul Villard, and Pierre and Marie Curie. While experimenting with naturally phosphorescent materials, they had discovered the radioactive properties of uranium and were the first to coin the phrase radiation, drawing the conclusion that the radioactivity and the new X-rays were linked. Shortly after, they discovered radium, a substance that was self-luminous and initially thought to be harmless. Industrial companies were eager to get their hands on it. However, one major event disrupted the initial findings. World War I crashed into the World Theater in 1914. The newly developed X-ray was in high demand on the front lines. Surgeons and doctors demanded that X-rays be included in field hospitals to aid in removal of bullets and shrapnel and identify and set broken bones. The French had a motorized X-ray unit in 1904, 4 years before the advent of the Model T. On the front lines, the Germans used a horse-drawn X-ray cart. Marie Curie herself invented a radiological car which proved to be vital, and she soon had a small fleet of the cars, nicknamed Little Curies. With X-rays becoming more and more commonplace as the war effort plodded on, the public soon grew used to the idea and praised the new discovery for aiding in their health. After the war ended, research started back up, and the new uranium mines, sources of radium, opened a wealth of possibilities in the industrial circuit. Fascinated by its novelty and eager to cash in on the new trend of radioactive items, a wealth of phony cure-alls involving radiation quickly hit store shelves. Because there was no regulation on consumable products, manufacturers ran wild. One trend was water invigorators, which were radiation-emitting coolers or nodules that would irradiate drinking water, which was thought to improve health. There was Radiowine, a tablet containing trace amounts of radium for energy, radioactive toothpaste, razors, beer, playing cards, balms and tissue creams, bread, and credit card-sized radium sources meant to be held near cigarettes. The catalog of irradiated items that have been historically recorded lists over 200 items, all of which have a source of radiation as its selling point. But of all the products, one became most synonymous with radiation and danger, a product called Undark, sold by a company in New Jersey. During World War I, men eschewed pocket watches for the more handy and accessible wristwatch. The soldiers returning home set a trend, and soon everyone wanted to wear one. One company in particular, the Ingersoll factory in New Jersey, was able to use a radium-laced paint called Undark to make its watch faces glow in the dark without needing to charge in the sun. They employed 70 women in 1916 who were instructed to paint small numbers and hands on the watches using the radium-laced paint. To keep the ends of their brushes pointed, they were instructed to tip their brushes by putting them in the corners of their mouths. Each time they tipped their brush, they were ingesting a small amount of radium. By 1922, most of the women had developed horrifying side effects, such as mouth, tooth, and esophageal cancers, and the eventual breakdown of their entire mandible. They became known as the Radium Girls. The women decided to sue the company in 1927, and when the case went to court in 1928, the news broke in headlines all over the world. This case would invigorate the newly then formed FDA, and went on to help the other factories develop more safety standards, but many came too late for the girls. In France, Marie Curie was also experiencing side effects from her work with radiation. When she first heard of the Radium Girls, she was able to compare it to some of the side effects she had witnessed firsthand in herself and the other women she trained in X-ray. Another product, known as Radithor, which promised to be a cure for any ailment caused by a lack of energy, would eventually lead to the death of famous athlete and socialite Eben Byers in 1932. The public was starting to take notice that maybe radiation wasn't as safe as it was touted to be. Marie Curie's eventual death of aplastic anemia in 1934, caused by her years of continual exposure to radiation, continued the narrative of radiation is dangerous. However, the majority of Americans were locked away from the rest of the scientific world thanks to the economic crash in 1929 and eventual depression that would last throughout most of the 30s. The concept of X-rays, however, continued to fascinate and continued to be used in medicine. Throughout the 20s and 30s, magazines featuring stories and small accompanying comics became the hot trend, as they were cheap, having been made from recycled wood which resulted in a pulpy texture, giving rise to the term pulp fictions. In 1937, a magazine called Spicy Mysteries ran a story and accompanying comic strip about a woman named Olga Mesmer, who had X-ray vision and could see through walls as well as super strength. While not directly what we would call a superhero, she was the first known character to appear in a comic strip who had X-ray vision. Olga's strip ran until 1938, when a new magazine came out that would change the world of comics forever. Action Comics No. 1, one of the first strictly comic magazines and featuring the first appearance of Superman, a costume hero and vigilante, hit the racks on May 3, 1938, beginning what is known to comic book historians as the golden age of comic books and changing the face of the entertainment industry forever. While Superman would not have X-ray vision until April of 1939, Superman is still this hero synonymous with X-ray vision, although he mostly uses it to look through walls or buildings. As America entered World War II, they needed to get the American public behind the war effort. Superman, who, it should be noted, was created by two Jewish men and was very Jewish in appearance, was enlisted in the war effort as well. The newly formed Marvel Comics also joined in, punching Nazis and foiling evil plots by Axis forces. In the scientific community and unbeknownst to the American public, several secret agencies had been working furiously on nuclear fission and the creation of nuclear weapons, paralyzed with fear that the German army would get the bomb before we did. We all know what happened. After the atom bombs dropped, the narratives of radiation and its effects began to differ vastly depending on what area of the world one inhabited. After the war ended, the view of Americans on atomic energy and radiation were vastly favorable. Atomic Man, the first superhero to be created as a result of experimentation with radioactive materials, premiered in November of 1945 issue of Headline Comics. Many other comics and books theorized on the future inventions that could be powered by the same atomic energy, leading to what is referred to as the atomic age of comic books. In Japan, the devastation was widespread. Those who had survived the terrible bombings were called hibakusha, and they were shunned from society. The devastating effects of radiation poisoning were still not well understood by medical science as a whole, and as a result many survivors were seen as disease-ridden and offered little in the way of initial medical assistance. Radiation became something to be feared and distrusted. The medical community began to generate reports of the biological effects of radiation, but they were slow in coming overseas. Meanwhile, the US, now seeing what the atomic bomb could do and spurred on by the hopeful public, continued its atomic testing throughout the 1940s and 50s, beginning to set up nuclear energy plants and stockpiling arms against Russia. The media bragged about America's scientific prowess. More and more superheroes interacted with radiation became more and more powerful. The Americans continued to test nuclear arms, which would eventually lead to devastating consequences among the soldiers who were subjected to them. They also tested arms on a small atoll in the Marshall Islands, called the Pacific Proving Grounds. This nuclear testing in this site led to widespread radiation-induced illnesses among the indigenous people. The bombings at this site also occurred very close to a Japanese fishing boat, thus creating the inspiration for the origin story of one of the most famous radiation-created characters in modern culture, introduced in Japan in 1954, Godzilla. In the original movie, called Gojira in Japan, a giant dinosaur-like creature is awoken from its underwater den by nuclear testing, and heads to the shoreline, wreaking havoc on nearby cities and reducing them to total waste. The original movie was a brutal metaphor for the American military and the bombs, and it was theorized as a way of cultural mourning and coping with the tragedy. When it came over to America, much of the original was cut, and a slapdash story following an American journalist in Japan was cut in. Appropriately enough, Godzilla proved to be the beginning of the end of the American atomic dream. The 1950s to the 1970s was a great time of civil unrest and cultural revolution in the US. The popularity of the Free Love and Return to Nature movements spurred protests against nuclear energy. More and more reports started to come in from Japan about the devastation back there by the nuclear bombs, and the people, disenchanted by the years spent in Korea and our losses in Vietnam, started to trust the government less and less. Gradually, the public in general turned against the idea of, quote, safe nuclear energy, especially with the threat of nuclear annihilation by Russia hanging over their heads. Even the superheroes began to slowly shift their attitudes. The Hulk, a comic that premiered in 1962, featured a scientist that was turned into a horrifying monster by gamma rays, similar to the Jekyll and Hyde story. And as we turned our eyes towards space and focused efforts on conservation, new safety laws started to become enacted, and we finally realized just how dangerous radiation could be. Now, though it is hard to comment on history while in the midst of it, X-ray modalities have proved to be crucial in identifying and assisting in the fight against COVID-19. It's difficult to say in this point in time where we will land on the other side of things. However, it is safe to say that X-rays and radiation have far more beneficial uses than harmful ones, and they aren't going anywhere anytime soon.